Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third and final day of the fourth School of Social Sciences Research Conference. I am JVR Gamboa from the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics, and I will be your moderator for Session 8. Our session theme is Change and Crisis, the New Constants, Labor, Demographic, and Political Shifts in the Philippines. Before we begin, let me recap the house rules. First, if you encounter connection problems or get disconnected during the session, you may enter the conference room again by clicking the unique Zoom link sent to you via the conference registration confirmation email. Please ensure that your microphone is turned off during the conference to minimize background noise during the presentations. If your bandwidth allows, you are free to keep your camera turned on throughout the conference session. Please use the chat box on the right side of your screen for any comments or questions related to the session. These will be read during the Q&A portion to be facilitated by the moderator. Participants will not be allowed to raise their hand and unmute during the Q&A session. Lastly, we value respect and courtesy the most in our conference sessions. For this session, we have 5 paper presentations. Each presentation is limited to 15 minutes only. I am instructed to inform speakers to wrap up on their final 2 minutes and stop the presentation should the speakers go beyond the allotted time. So our first presentation is entitled Access to Information and Other Correlates of Vote Buying and Selling, Insights from Philippine Data. Let's virtually welcome Dr. Tristan Canare and Dean Ronald U. Mendoza from the Ateneo de Manila University.
The title of the paper that I will present today is Access to Information and Other Correlates of Vote Buying and Selling Behavior, Insights from Philippine Data. Now, the title of the paper suggests that it also looked at the correlates of vote buying and selling, but due to time constraint, I will only discuss the results of the paper pertaining to the relationship between access to information and vote selling behavior. Now, if you're interested, this paper is forthcoming in the Journal of Interdisciplinary Economics. The first thing that I would like to discuss is how do we define vote buying? Vote buying is commonly defined in the literature as the offering of cash or other objects of value in exchange for votes, while vote selling is the acceptance of this offer and agreeing to vote for the candidate linked to the offer. Now, vote buying and vote selling have been defined several ways in the literature. For some, for it to be considered vote buying and vote selling, the transaction actually has to change the mind of the voter, meaning he or she should switch from candidate A to candidate B. For some others, vote buying and selling can be defined only with the implicit insinuation that by giving such goods, the voter or the receiver should vote for the candidate. So, vote buying has been defined several ways, but for the purpose of this study, we will stick to this definition. Now, vote buying and vote selling are more than just simple market transactions. It's not just a basic exchange of a service, which is voting, and a fee, which is the money or good paid to the voter. Because vote buying is illegal, the vote buying and selling contract between the candidate and the voter cannot be enforced under the usual mechanisms of the law. So, completing the vote buying transaction, which includes the voter accepting the offer and voting for the candidate for whom the offer was made, is subject to certain normative and cultural subtexts. Now, according to the literature, various forms of political patronage and clientelism, which includes vote buying, can adversely affect development and political outcomes. Vote buying has been shown to be associated with inefficient distribution of resources, corruption and inefficient government, and weak accountability and institutional growth. Now, why can vote buying lead to these inefficiencies? Well, for one, um, right now we have what we call representative democracy, right? So basically, we elect our representatives, and those representatives will, on on our behalf, design policies. Okay, but with vote buying, the purpose of this representative democracy can be defeated because with representative democracy, voters are supposed to vote for candidates whose programs align most with the voters' preference. With vote buying, there is a different basis for voting. Okay, so there can be mismatch between the voter's preference and the incentive of the elected politician. Now, although vote buying can produce suboptimal outcomes, it persists because it can be effective under certain conditions, such as when voters lack information and when majority of voters have low income and when there is culture of reciprocity in the society. Because of its negative effects, several studies have attempted to determine what interventions may prevent vote buying. The central theme of most of these interventions is providing the voters with more information. For instance, in a study by Banerjee et al. In 2011, they disseminated information on the performance of incumbent officials. Another implemented voter education campaigns. And another implemented campaigns to convince voters to promise not to sell their votes. The basis for these interventions is that access to good quality information has been shown to not only affect voting behavior and political decisions, but also produce better decisions. However, the effect of information on voting behavior depends largely on the quality of this information. So it's not just the quantity or the presence of information, but the quality of this information. So, building on earlier literature, the main objective of this study is to evaluate the relationship between access to information and vote selling behavior. Specifically, we looked at the relationship between information access and the propensity to accept the vote buying offer and to vote for the candidate for whom the offer was made. This study looked primarily at the source of the information or the quality of information rather than the quantity or presence of information. That is mostly what the existing literature studies. So the question is, why and how can information affect vote buying decisions? And why differing qualities of information can have varying effects? Well, for one, if you possess information on the illegality and the corresponding penalties of vote selling, then it can disincentivize voters from selling their votes. Also, if voters can somehow have access to information on the negative effects of vote buying and vote selling, then it can have the same effect. It can disincentivize voters from selling their votes. However, there are still less direct reasons why access to information can affect vote selling behavior. And the direction of these effects can be ambiguous. So let's give an example. Some voters justify selling their votes by the poor quality of public services and the inferior performance of elected officials. So they would say that, well, I'm not getting anything from them. They're performing poorly. So I might as well accept their vote buying offer. At least I can get something out of them. That's one common justification among vote sellers. Now, if this is the case, information on the performance of the officials can either exacerbate or curb vote buying and selling. If the voter possesses information that the incumbent is a poor performer, then it can encourage vote buying. On the other hand, if the voter possesses information that the incumbent performs well, then it can limit vote buying and vote selling because they cannot use this as justification. So, information can actually affect vote selling behavior differently. It can have contrasting effects. Now, to look at the relationship between access to information and the propensity to sell one's vote, we utilized a survey data. Okay, so the data came from a survey of low-income voters in Metro Manila. We had 1,200 observations. We implemented multi-stage stratified random sampling covering all 17 cities in NCR with the number of respondents per city proportional to the number of voters. And since vote buying can be a sensitive topic, although there are some literature showing that more or less it's accepted in the Philippines, we still used some direct and indirect questions. So what we did here was we compared the answers to the direct and indirect questions, and we found them to be sufficiently the same. Specifically, when you say direct questions, you are asking someone, have you experienced vote buying? That's one type of a direct question. An indirect question is, do you know someone who experienced vote buying? So basically, we compared the proportion for each question who answered in the affirmative with the direct question and the percentage of respondents who answered in the affirmative using the indirect questions. And they're sufficiently similar. So the survey consists of several vote buying questions. One is, was there anything offered to you or to your immediate family in exchange for your vote or the vote of your immediate family. So this is the question that identifies which among the respondents were offered something or who received a vote buying offer. We also asked what was offered. Is it food, money, anything with sufficient value? Okay, did they accept? Did the respondent accept the offer? And did they vote for the candidate who made the offer or the candidate being represented by the person who made the offer? The survey also includes socio-demographic and other household characteristics questions. We run this regression. The dependent variable is this variable vote cell, which is a dummy is equal to 1 if the respondent accepted the offer and voted for the candidate. The variable news I is the number of hours spent watching, reading, or listening to news. So this is the quantity of information. And source I. This is a vector of 12 sources of news, which can be used to represent the quality of information. Okay, these are 12 dummy variables equal to 1 if the variable is among the top 3 sources of news. And what are these 12 sources? Social media, internet blogs, websites of newspapers, website of TV and radio stations, online-only news outlets, other sources of news and information on the internet, printed broadsheets, printed tabloids, AM radio stations, non-cable TV channels, cable TV channels, and others. Also, to help us in our study, we asked communication experts in determining which of these are generally high quality sources of information. And this regression equation was estimated for different types of vote buying, all offers, money, food, and other materials with considerable value. We only included in the regression the observations who experienced a vote buying offer. Now, the results. Hours spent watching, reading, and listening to news is insignificant in all regressions, which means that the quantity of information is an insignificant determinant of the propensity to sell one's vote. Now, here's the interesting part. Survey respondents who included broadsheet newspapers among their top 3 sources of news and information are less likely to accept a vote buying offer and vote for the candidate. While survey respondents who included tabloids and AM radio stations among their top 3 sources of news and information are more likely to accept a vote buying offer and vote for the candidate. So the results suggest that more reliable sources of information, broadsheet newspapers in this case, are associated with lower probability of accepting the vote buying offer and voting for the candidate. On the other hand, the less reliable sources, such as tabloids and AM radio stations, are associated with higher probability of completing the vote buying transaction. Access to higher quality information is associated with lower likelihood of accepting the vote buying offer and voting for the candidate for whom the offer was made. And that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Canare. Let's now go to the second paper presentation, which is entitled From Dependency to Autonomy, Local Governance, Fiscal Capacity, and the Outlook for LGU Performance in the Post-COVID and Post-Mandanas Era. Let's virtually welcome Mr. Jerry Cruz from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Mr. Enrico Lavinia from the University of California, Davis.
Thanks, JB. Let me share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you for the opportunity to present. I'm also involved with the economics department, so it's always good to be back in touch with my roots in Ateneo. With me today, he'll be here to also answer your questions about our survey, is Rico Lavinia. So Rico, feel free to interject anything if I miss out on an important point that you wanted to emphasize for this. So this is the leading chapter of an upcoming flagship report of the UNDP Pintig Lab, that's the data science unit of UNDP in the Philippines. So what we are arguing is essentially in the middle of not only of COVID, but the biggest shift in the decentralization framework in the Philippines, we need to look much more carefully at local government's fiscal capacity, because this is going to be a very crucial factor as to how well they will perform over the next few years. So I'll hope to make this clear in what's next. So let's start with what's relatively obvious to most of us. The COVID-19 pandemic has lightened up somewhat, but it's still very much with us. And the effects of which are going to be felt for a very long time to come. We know that based on SWS data on the left, our poverty levels have been hit, and the distribution of the burden has not been equal, with the poor being particularly worse hit than higher income folks. And that's even more pronounced when you look at hunger, such as on the right side plots, which we also gather from SWS data. So all over the board, we should see setbacks with regard to the sustainable development goals. But what's particularly striking is that even in the middle of these setbacks, COVID-19 has paved way for some windows of opportunities for gains, in other words. So to give you one example, many of us are aware that in the middle of the lockdowns, air quality improved in Metro Manila. Not sure if it's still as good as in 2020 and 2021, but it's also quite striking that because of the lockdowns, we also witnessed better air quality as well as better road safety during that entire period. Now, it's not necessarily to say that these are sustainable gains, but nonetheless, these kind of changes have spurred the imagination of many people in different sectors of society, as you can see, especially when it comes to public transportation, as well as bicycle lanes. The key point is that COVID has brought a crisis, and crisis can also bring opportunity. Now, and the opportunity and crisis is also manifested in what you're going to see as the most crucial transition year based in lived memory. Because not only are we still dealing with COVID-19, not only are we still dealing with the 2022 elections, we are witnessing the single biggest shift in the country's decentralization framework since the passage of the 1991 Local Government Code. Essentially, several years back, there was there was a Supreme Court ruling in 2018 on the Mandanas versus Ochoa case, which is basically deliberating to what extent are we going to divide other national government taxes which are not yet covered under local government's internal revenue allotment. And the Duterte administration, in response to this, released EO Executive Order 138, which mandates the full devolution of these resources. So it's not only providing these new taxes, these new fiscal resources to local government, it also comes with new responsibilities, all of those which are essentially outlined in the local government code. Now, this shift in the country's decentralization framework has raised concerns from many different corners. On one side, some critics are concerned that local governments will not have the capacity to be able to absorb these additional resources, but especially these kinds of responsibilities. And one of the most prominent examples is this graph, which I show on the right-hand side from the World Bank Philippine Economic Update in 2021. The essential argument is that as you move into more capital-intensive responsibilities, the capacity of local government units to execute these budget declines. Naturally, with these capacity constraints are not equally distributed, some local governments will fall behind, especially poorer ones. Giving more resources to local governments can also disincentivize them from maximizing the fiscal powers that they already have. I'll elaborate on why that's a problem in a bit. Naturally, you're also giving down more powers to political dynasties, and this is all being done in the middle of the 2022 elections. So there may be all kinds of perverse electoral incentives and incentives for dynasties to possibly game this shift, which we're now seeing in this particular period. Now, what's going to be crucial, and many people have emphasized that we need to keep our eyes on the ball with regards to accountability to whether local governments will be able to spend. But our claim in this particular report is that the probably the biggest neglected dimension of this transition has been the capacity of local government to raise their own source revenue. They have capacity to tax, they have capacity to raise their own revenues from their local sources such as property tax, business tax, revenue, service fees, so on and so forth. And as you can see on the right, on the graph on the left, it's only really been cities in the Philippines which are not dependent on fiscal transfers from the central government, Most local governments that we are aware of generally are overwhelmingly dependent. They cannot raise their own funds. They depend on lifelines from the central government for them to be able to have the resources that they need. Now, when you look at the literature, both in economics and political science, this is a major problem. And the reason why is because most people do not appreciate that taxation and government's ability to rely on their own source revenue is linked to a whole variety of crucial positive spillover benefits. In general, if you want to have better state capacity, you need to have your own source of revenue. You have more resources to pay better people. You need to have better systems to be able to raise more revenues, and that spills over to other areas. Taxes, people don't like being taxed, but the implication of that is that because they don't like being taxed, they put local governments on guard to spend their revenues more carefully and with greater accountability. So it is linked with better accountability and responsiveness, because governments will rely more on tax from economic sources that inclines them to improve their economic base. It also, along with accountability, to provide better services and all these host of benefits. The idea is that if you go back to the theory of Thomas Hobbes on the social contract, Thomas Hobbes actually puts tax as the linchpin of that social contract. And this is when comes out also in the phrase when you hear the term no taxation without representation. And the problem is with the shift in the Mandanas ruling, local governments are at risk in terms of becoming more dependent on fiscal transfers rather than more fiscally autonomous. And this means that all these possible benefits from own source revenue reliance will be forgone, with possible perverse incentives in the years to come. So what we did to be able to demonstrate this is not a very causally identified design, but what we did is gather all the data that we could on local governments, and we subjected this to what we call a multi-level model. One way to think about this is that we try to compare only apples to apples and oranges to oranges. So what we do is that we group all the local governments in the Philippines, all 1,634 LGUs, and we put them together into groups within the same province, within the same LGU type, within the same level of income. And what we do is that we control for other variables across different kinds of good governance metrics that we're particularly interested in. We control for variables such as the share of urbanization, the average level of education, poverty incidence, whether you have a Pat dynasty, and other civil society groups within the local government that we're talking about. And what we find is when local governments rely more on local source revenue, this was from 2014 to 2016, it is associated with a lower rate of spending on what we call general public services. Now that's actually a misnomer, because this is basically maintenance upkeep. It's basically administrative expenses of the local government level, which this means that they're not actually spending on development. They're not actually spending on services which they provide to their constituents. So this is the very first step that needs to be done if we want local governments to become more developmental. They need to start spending on services. And what we find is that there's a fairly robust correlation over here, that local governments, as they rely more on their own source revenues, they spend less on this, they spend more on services. What particular services do they tend to spend on? As you can see in the charts, we look at different kinds of spending categories. Particularly strong are education and economic services. For education, we believe this is the case because of the Special Education Fund. It's a real property surtax, which is added on that. For economic services, this is more like agriculture, infrastructure, and we think the reason is because of the economic growth incentive that we mentioned earlier. Now, health and housing do not have any particular significant rating when we estimate when we look at them in general. But what's interesting is that when we look at highly urbanized cities, where most health services need to be provided, as well as housing, we do have a positive and significant effect among highly urbanized cities. And finally, last two important things on this observational analysis, we do find that it tends to create capacity and accountability spillovers. What we did is that we got the compliance rate with COA annual audit report recommendations. How much of that percentage do local governments comply with in a given year? And it turns out when they rely more, they become more responsive to acting on what COA recommends them to do. What are these kinds of recommendations? They say something like, make your budget transparent, improve your public financial management practices, make sure that your practices are transparent, don't engage in this kind of irregular activity. So that seems to be a strong indication that this accountability spillover, there is a correlation for it in the case of the Philippines. And finally, as you were saying earlier, the absorptive capacity, bringing spending down to the local government level might create what we call, what's that term again? Underspending. And it turns out local governments, when it comes to spending, they underspend less when they rely more on their own source revenues in relation to when it comes to the local development fund, which is the single biggest infrastructure fund at the local government level. So underspending becomes less of a problem as they're able to raise more of their own revenues. So we subject this to different robustness checks, but the most important thing is that we also ran a local online survey in 2021. And the basic idea is that in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was not enough information on how LGs were faring and how they were preparing for the implementation of the full devolution transition. So what we essentially did is that we partnered with UNDP and DILG, and we disseminated a basically 7-part online survey using Qualtrics to essentially all provincial, city, municipal LGUs over a 1-month period. So this was a very, very big operation, but we were very fortunate that we didn't get all of them to respond. But we did get a very significant response rate equaling around 1/3 in the best ones, such as planning development officers, treasurers, and the RM officers. Now, note this does not cover everything. There's probably a non-random pattern in who answers and who isn't. And what we did find is that it's more biased that high capacity LGUs are more likely to answer, which means that what I'll be sharing with you guys might be a conservative estimate, meaning we're understating the magnitude of the problem. So what are our 4 main insights from this survey? First, LGUs have been slow to adopt innovative governance strategies. The use of ICT in governance is still not the norm. There's a significant disparity in terms of technical capacity and preparedness for the Mandanas ruling. And number 4, strengthening LGU own source revenues will be critical to improving LGU capacity for service delivery. But we asked a lot of questions, so I'm only going to some of the highlight reels with regards to the survey. So to give you for one example, a lack of innovative measures. Raising their own revenues is going to be crucial because the impact of COVID will make itself felt in 2023 in terms of the transfers, because the ERAs are computed from a 3-year lag. So the shortfall in national revenues will hit local governments in 2023, which makes it crucial for them to raise their own revenues. And that to maximize that, they're going to have to explore new options. Now, what we did is that we gave them several different options: business taxes, real property taxes, idle land taxes, real property tax, and all of their taxes. And it turns out all of them tend to be sticking to what they tend to know. So the biggest revenue earners at the local level tend to be business taxes and real property taxes. As you can see, 75% checked yes for RPT. Whether they plan to raise that in the years ahead. 90% for business taxes. The blank here means no. So sorry for that. But by comparison, a very underused tax are idle land taxes and real property transfers. And take a look at the numbers. 80% said no. Only 1/5 said yes. 7 out of 10 for real property transfers said no. Only 3 out of 10 said yes when it comes to real. So they're not maximizing, especially the more innovative and the ones which will require greater technical capacity on their part. Use of ICT in governance is still not the norm. So to give you one example, we asked this question Do you currently use any ICT systems in monitoring the various programs, projects, and activities that your LGU is implementing? And believe it or not, of all of the LGUs which responded, 3 out of 5 said no. They don't use an ICT system to monitor their only 1/3 said yes. So when it comes to ICT, this makes things much more efficient. This can make things potentially much more transparent. So it's a huge foregone opportunity. And intensifies the capacity deficits that they may face at the local government level. It's also manifested when we see, have they tried to develop a passive digital contact tracing system? And same story. Only a minority did, around 2/3 did not of all of those. Now, in terms of capacity and preparedness for the Mandanas ruling, what they're currently supposed to be doing now is planning for the next phase. Now, the key is the precedent that we have for this is in 2017, they downscaled, the DOTR downscaled the development of what we call the local public transport route plan. So that was previously supposed to be done at the national level, and that was moved in 2017 to the local government level. Now, how many of them in the 4 years since that period have actually developed a local public transport route plan? And as you can see, there's a very significant chunk out of many of them which have not been able to do that. And in some regions, there are the gaps are very glaring. Surprisingly, NCR, most of NCR LGUs did not have. Also, when you're going to Caraga, most did not have. So many LGUs, and surprisingly, not the ones whom you think may be more better positioned to make gains on this, are going to face additional challenges in terms of managing the resources and responsibilities for planning for the Mandanas ruling. And then finally, we mentioned earlier that own source revenue is going to be crucial to managing this transition. So to give you one example, we asked this question of the budget officers, what constraints are likely to prevent your LGUs from fully spending the additional funds provided to it by the Mandanas ruling next year from a scale of 0 to 10? Now, what's particularly interesting here, these are the options that we provided to them. 0 means it's not a problem. 10 means it's a huge problem. And the single biggest item is this one: lack of additional local funding for investment projects, which is a 6.2. Now, this seems to connect to the underspending problem in the sense that what they receive from transfers is usually not enough for them to be able to undertake additional projects. So this offers one possible linkage as why we saw this better efficiency in executing their local development funds from that chart I presented earlier. Beyond that, other interesting things that you see here, number of staff, manpower is the second highest, 5.3. Capacity of staff in project management and implementation is also particularly high. So, and generally the capacity of staff is the biggest item, which seems to be, after the lack of funds, the single biggest bottleneck to executing, to improving their service delivery capacity and maximizing the use of the Mandanas ruling. So based on our survey evidence, as well as our observation, as our multi-level model, neither of them are perfect. But when you put them together, they form a consistent, coherent story that local governments generally seem to be underprepared for the Mandanas ruling. And the crucial thing is that the Mandanas ruling is currently planned to be undertaken in only 3 years. The most ambitious transition in the local devolution framework, we only have 3 years for that. What we're seeing is that maybe we need a bit more time. Maybe we may need one presidential term for local governments to be able to make the adjustment, especially given that we're going to see the long-term effects of COVID, including in public finances, starting in 2023. We need to maximize the use of good government conditionalities. There are some mechanisms, I don't want to get too much into technicalities, but from what we've seen is that this has not yet been maximized from what we would serve of the design of the Mandanas ruling. It seems it's going to be provided in general, whereas we want local governments to be in the best possible position to make use of them. Staff capacity deficits seem to be particularly problematic when it comes to maximizing the devolution transition. So normally, local governments are constrained from hiring new personnel beyond a certain cap. We think that that the national government may want to consider temporarily suspending this cap on how much they can spend on hiring new personnel, given that the capacity of their human resources seems to be one of the biggest bottlenecks that we've seen. Since we're talking about raising revenues, we think that revenues can be an opportunity for forging what we call fiscal social contracts. So beyond simply engaging local governments, we need to engage civil society groups, we need to engage businesses and other kinds of citizens, not only on accountability, the anti-corruption and expenditure side, but also on the revenue raising side. But ultimately, the long term is that the reason why we're facing these challenges is because of the local government code. We're not advocating for a move to federalism, but ultimately, the reasons why local governments have not improved since the 1991 local government code and have continued to manifest challenges since that point is because there are perverse incentives which are lodged within the very design of our fiscal decentralization framework. And unfortunately, the Mandanas ruling, while moving towards fiscal full devolution, is not going to fix that. We need to reform the local government code if we want to provide the right set of incentives for local governments to move towards better fiscal autonomy, towards better accountability, and towards better state capacity over the long run. Thank you very much, and we'll take any questions later on, both me and Rico.
Thank you, Jerry, for the presentation. Okay. So for our third presentation, the paper is entitled Adopting Miller's First Principles for Online Food Delivery Platforms, Labor Regulation in the Philippines, which I myself will deliver. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen? Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I am JVR Gamboa, faculty member of the Department of Economics at Ateneo de Manila University. I am currently studying law at the University of the Philippines and set to graduate in a few months from now. Today, I will present an exploratory paper on labor regulation of online food delivery riders and platforms in the Philippines. I originally wrote this paper for my administrative law class, thus the emphasis on the legal aspect. This was published last year as a policy insight in the Philippine Journal of Public Policy by the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies. The outline of this presentation is straightforward. First, we will discuss the background, then the framework, and then the analysis by looking at the proposed regulations in the 18th Congress and some observations. Okay, let's proceed. Let me start with this perennially quoted statement in Supreme Court decisions related to labor. Labor is not a mere employee of capital, but its active and equal partner. This serves as a guidepost for this paper, as well as the wider discourse on online food delivery riders, who are often referred to by their platforms, whom they are affiliated with, as partners rather than as employees. For this paper, we define sharing economy as an economic model where people are creating and sharing goods, services, space, and money with each other. Under this broad range of technological and commercial innovation, we zoom into online food delivery platforms such as GrabFood, Foodpanda, and the then existing LalaFood. Being an online food delivery rider across these platforms offers a unique livelihood opportunity for Filipinos, especially due to the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the most cited advantages of being a rider is the flexibility in hours, while having the ability to earn livable wage. However, despite this perceived increase in options for livelihood, the industry is not isolated from the horrors experienced by Filipino workers. For instance, the shutdown of LalaFood in February 2021 left delivery riders without any form of separation assistance or any opportunity to transition to another job. So in this paper, we take a small step in answering the broader question: what legal protections do online food delivery riders have? Let us first examine the sharing economy and labor by looking at the triangular relationship from Stewart and Stanford. In this characterization, the worker and the intermediary are governed by the contract, setting the terms and conditions of the worker's access and continued use of the intermediary's platform. Another contract governs the relationship between the intermediary and the end user, which is usually agreed to by the end user upon signing up to become a member of or generally to have access to the digital platform. The two previously mentioned contracts are not as contentious as the contract, if there is any to begin with, between the worker and the end user. This is also why the intermediaries have often used the argument that they merely provide the platform for these two market players to meet. To put more emphasis on the implications of this triangular relationship, suppose we have an online food delivery platform named Food Zebra, and Juan as an end user, and Pedro as a delivery rider. Suppose Pedro, due to natural elements such as rain, caused Juan's order to be drenched in transit. Will Pedro be liable as the person responsible to deliver such in good condition? Or will Food Zebra be liable as the platform, together with Pedro? In another situation, suppose Pedro in transit found himself in a vehicular accident that results to disability. Can he claim compensation as a matter of right for work-related disability? Consider, however, if he is not in actual transit, but waiting for bookings when the accident occurred. Can Food Zebra be released from liability because it merely acts as a platform? Defining the relationship among the parties, especially those that concern the workers, is crucial because the corresponding rights and obligations are most often dictated by such relationship. We now look at what Philippine law states. One of the fundamental lessons in labor law is distinguishing an employee from a non-employee, which may include an independent contractor. We have what we call the fourfold test in determining the existence of employment relationship, which I will not extensively discuss in the interest of time. The key takeaway, however, at this point is that Philippine law clearly states that the factual situations of the engagement, such as that between the online food delivery rider and the platform, prevail over any contractual stipulations that prevent or waive an employment relationship to the detriment, most of the time, of the worker. This slide shows the various legal rights from the Constitution and from the various laws that are granted to labor, but are truly mostly applied only to employees. With employer-employee relationship as a precondition to nearly all of the protections afforded by the current laws, independent contractors, under which the delivery riders are forcibly categorized, are left without recourse, except, of course, from the rights and obligations under their engagement contracts. It is then imperative for us to look at possible novel regulations that can respond to this innovation in the labor sector. At this point, we refer to Stephen R. Miller's first principles, or the building blocks on which any future regulation of a sharing economy industry must rest. He originally used this in examining the regulation of short-term rental markets such as Airbnb in the United States. In so doing, the 10 first principles of Miller are translated into question format, which was then used as a quasi-checklist for this paper's purposes. For Principle 1, Does the regulation provide different response to each industry? For Principle 2, does the regulation consider the industry as legitimate? For Principle 3, does the regulation provide for information or data sharing measures? For Principle 4, does the regulation provide a long-term perspective? For Principle 5, does the regulation consider other market players? For Principle 6, does the regulation consider undeveloped or underdeveloped future market? For Principle 7, does the regulation consider existing regulations? For Principle 8, does the regulation provide a creative and innovative solution? For Principle 9, does the regulation consider current and possible future harm to be prevented? And lastly, for Principle 10, does the regulation consider multisectoral stakeholders? Now we examine the proposed legislations filed in the 18th Congress, that is the current Congress we have now, and ask whether such are consistent with the first principles. Of course, this is also done to at least see the efficacy of these proposals in protecting our delivery riders. First, we look at House Bill number 9279. There are only two main provisions contained in this bill, which pertain to the coverage and range of benefits sought to be legislated. First, the bill refers to delivery riders covered by it as independent contractors, and that's a quote. Second, the Department of Labor and Employment is tasked to identify the specific benefits and the computation of said benefits. A preliminary assessment would show that, in fact, such a bill may even regress the welfare of delivery riders because it specifically legislates and validates their legal characterization as independent contractors instead of employees. Thus, they lose their potential claims later on for the rights and protections that I showed in the earlier slide. Contrary to Principles 4 and 9, this path merely offers a band-aid solution to the lack of benefits and protections as currently experienced, but ignores the long-term effects and future unintended consequences of this provision. Further, the blanket authority delegated to DOLE to craft the benefits to be granted exhibits a violation of Principle 7 for failure to consider how existing regulations can play a role. Second, we look at House Bill number 7805. This bill covers the broader category of internet transactions centered on consumer protection. Delivery riders are covered by the law or by the bill under the name Ride-Hailing Service Partner, which refers to third parties who offer their services to transport or deliver food, parcels, or any other item on behalf of ride-hailing service providers or the platforms. The bill protects delivery riders by punishing consumers who cancel confirmed orders and who unreasonably shame, demean, embarrass, or humiliate ride-hailing service partners or the delivery riders. Although these protections are laudable regulatory initiatives that meet most of the principles, especially Principle 8 for a creative and innovative solution, this paper argues that the nomenclature of delivery riders as ride-hailing service partner is contrary to Principle 7 and 10. Instead of making progress on delivery riders' labor rights, it seems to disregard the gap in labor protection and favor the status quo. Third, we look at Senate Bill 1677. The bill mandates online food delivery platforms to establish a reimbursement scheme in favor of the delivery riders, covering the entire amount advanced to purchase the ordered items in case of cancellation of confirmed orders. Comparing the three bills mentioned in this paper, this bill presents the least harmful regulation for delivery riders and their labor rights. It does not unduly relegate delivery riders to mere independent contractors by means of law. However, While it offers a direct and straightforward solution to the problems of unjustified cancellations, the bill misses an opportunity to craft a holistic labor regulation for delivery riders as prescribed in Principles 4, 6, and 9, which would go beyond the short-term intervention sought to be enacted in this bill. We now go to the last part of the presentation. I will share my preliminary observations and a very wide space for further research as well as policy work on this topic. First, I just want to emphasize that this paper does not intend to propose an ideal labor regulation for online food delivery platforms. Further, the assessment made herein does not intend to emphasize the loopholes in the proposed bills. Instead, the essential takeaway must be the difficulty of regulating an innovation, such as online food delivery platforms, in a way that is mutually beneficial to most, if not all, stakeholders, especially to the vulnerable of them. As to the first principles, the sample of proposed regulations shows lack of long-term perspective, or Principle 4, lack of consideration of current or possible future harm to be prevented, or Principle 9, and the lack of consideration of existing regulations, or Principle 7. Possible models for the sharing economy are the multilateral legal relationships currently existing in overseas employment and in legitimate contracting or subcontracting. Conclude, as it now stands, there remains no legal protection, at least in the realm of labor law, in favor of online food delivery riders. Although the test of employment relationship exists as the saving grace to the rider's precarious working conditions, it is futile until litigated. Unless there is a government policy or regulation, whether through a law, an administrative rule, or a Supreme Court decision, that expressly provides for an employment relationship, then the status quo of an unprotected and unregulated sector of the market prevails. Delivery riders remain as mere partners instead of equal partners in the sharing economy. Thank you for listening. Okay. We now go to the fourth presentation, which is entitled Industry, a Destination for Local Migrant Workers. Let's all virtually welcome Mr. Sherwin Toring from Zamboanga Peninsula Polytechnic State University.
Thank you, Sir JB. Can you see my screen?
Not yet, sir.
Okay
Not
na po
yet,
ba?
not yet, sir. We still can't see it. Maybe you can reshare your screen, sir.
Hi, JV. I think Mr. Sherwin has technical difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
Wait
He
a moment.
just got back. I don't know if it's okay. He's now in the Zoom meeting again.
Can you see it this time, Sir JB?
Not yet, sir.
Okay. Sorry, because there was a power interruption from my end. May I ask the technical to just share my slide on my behalf?
Yes, we can be the one to share your slides po, sir. Sandali lang po.
Ah, sige po.
Hello, sir. Are you able to see the screen? We've shared your presentation, so kindly just cue our technical team.
Okay.
Cue.
Thank you. Uh, Buenos dias a todos. Thank you, everyone. And first of all, I'd also like to thank Dr. Magante for accommodating me in this panel. Now, this paper, which is a very simple one, was written during the pre-pandemic. Colleagues was actually a requirement for a course back when I was doing my coursework in Cebu. So, next slide, please. So to start with, the employment opportunity that the industry is providing has been without a doubt
Hi, Mr. Toring.
Sir JB, sorry, may brown out kasi dito sa akin.
Yes. Here. Okay. While we're waiting for Mr. Toring to settle again his connection, maybe we can first proceed with the fifth presentation before we go back to Mr. Toring. Um, and the title of the presentation is the Determinants of Migration, Italian Regional Factors, and the Relationship with Filipino Migrant Labor Supply. And for this paper, let's virtually welcome Dr. Myre Caroline Magante from Ateneo de Manila University.
Good day, everyone. I am Mary Caroline Magante, and today I will be presenting my work titled Determinants of Migration, Italian Regional Factors, and the Relationship with Filipino Migrant Labor Supply. In Italy, recent declines in the overall population and large rates of outmigration have led to labor shortages within particular sectors and fields. The falling population is only made stable by the immigration of foreign laborers. It is reported that between 8 to 10% of each region's population are foreign-born immigrants. Labor migration has helped to fill the need for low-skilled labor in manufacturing, social and domestic services, and healthcare in particular. The largest sources of migrant labor in Italy are from Romania, Albania, Morocco, China, Ukraine, and the Philippines in that order. However, in the recent years, significant fluctuations were observed in the immigration of Filipino labor. Over the period of 11 years, there was a 96.94% drop of number of Filipino labor migrants in Italy. So there are a lot of debates regarding the various reasons that cause the relative inelasticity of migration in Europe. I can read and Feld and Perry cite that elasticity of migration to various indicators, such as regional wage and differences in unemployment in Europe, is less responsive. However, Neighbor argues that although the labor migration studies primarily consider topics such as the adjustments in the labor markets as brought about by migration and the consequences to labor market destination, few studies take into consideration the spatial dimension. Consequently, it is only through including migration in discussions that the spatial dimensions of the labor market are considered. Hence, this paper contributes to the analysis of location-specific factors. By excluding the location-specific factors, particularly at a smaller scale, there is less understanding of the reasons for migration or even migration variation. So, the objective of the study is simple. There is an opportunity to examine the specific migrant ethnicity reactions to the smaller scale indicators. As such, the lack of understanding of the Filipino labor's migrant reactions to a specific country's regional indicators still remains unfilled. This paper aims to fill that gap by exploring the geographic and economic factors at a local scale that drives Filipino migrant inflows. In short, this paper studies the reactions to demographic and economic specific indicators and contributes to the advancement of knowledge in a geographic and ethnic specific manner using two lenses. First, using figures from all regions of Italy as the geographic focus, and second, labor migrants of Philippines as the ethnic focus. The main contribution of this research is investigating the region-specific drivers of the annual inflow of Filipino migrants from the Philippines to the various regions in Italy, and contributes to the findings of Mackenzie et al., Yang, Piaggi et al., Etzo, and Piaggi et al. All the years are presented before you. As for the data and methodology, this research employs regional data retrieved from the Instituto Nazionale di Statistica, or STAT, which is the primary source of official statistics in Italy. Additional data for controls were also obtained from the World Bank. The period of this research is from 2007 to 2017, covering all Italian regions at the level of NUTS 2 administrative division. The variables used are flashed before you. We have regional inflow of Filipino labor migrants, which is based on the verdicts of Spain to foreigners given by the respective body, regional GDP at constant prices, regional unemployment, regional housing cost, which is the average monthly expenditure in euros, regional foreign population, sans Filipino population, regional migrant Filipino stock, and Philippine GDP growth rate. This paper adopts empirical models, both test the different indices that drive the regional inflow of Filipino migration. The first empirical model employs static data analysis. The second model is a dynamic panel data analysis to handle possible issues of indigeneity. This estimates consider 11 years and 20 Italian regions. To measure the impact of regional indicators, GDP, housing cost, unemployment, and Filipino migrant stock on the total labor migrant inflow per region, double log or log-log regression is used. With the first empirical model, the elasticities of the independent variables in relation to the dependent variable can be efficiently identified. The model is presented by the equation 1 in first screen. The second set of models used in this research is the dynamic panel data approach, specifically the generalized methods of moments or GMM, to further examine the validity of the results in the static models and rule out probable indigeneity problems. This research utilized a more sophisticated analysis in the form dynamic panel data estimators for the specific difference GMM, which is shown by the equation number 2 in your screen. So first, let's discuss the results of the static model. In the static models, the results find no relationship between Italy's economic performance as measured by the regional real GDP and regional unemployment with the inflow of migrant laborers. Furthermore, this research finds no consistent economic predictors for the inflow of labor migrants. This lack of responsiveness of Filipino labor migrant inflow to economic variables is parallel with the findings of Naveri and Paini and Machin in their studies of Italian migration. On the other hand, the regional housing cost has an inverse relationship with the migrant labor inflow. However, it is also statistically insignificant. Finally, regardless of control variables in the model, all simulations resulted in a significant Filipino migrant stock at a 99% level of confidence, even though it is inversely correlated with the dependent variable. This is consistent with the findings of French scholars such as MacDonald, Piaget, and Zell about chain migration for fast. It is the existence of Filipino communities in various Italian regions that drives the migration of Filipino labor. Although this finding is consistent across models, the inverse relationship between the dependent variable and the regional Filipino migrant stock is unexpected. As the total Filipino migrant stock increases, the inflow of labor migrants decreases. In the context of networks and connections, but not in the context of employment competition, this is counterintuitive, mainly because having a network reduces the cost of finding jobs. As for the results of the dynamic model, the lag of labor migration inflow, regional unemployment, and real GDP resulted in significant results at a 10% level of confidence. The significant relationship between the unemployment and the inflow of Filipino labor migrants remains to be positive in the same direction as the results in the static model. This shows that the regional unemployment positivity, and in the case of the dynamic model, significantly drives the inflow of migrant labor. The same interpretation can be claimed for the relationship between regional real GDP and the lag of migrant labor inflow. Finally, the Filipino migrant stock remains to be significant, even in the dynamic models, but a lower level of confidence. So as for the discussion, after running various estimates by using static and dynamic models, both sets of estimators conclude the very same driver for Filipino migration to Italian regions. It is the Filipino migrant stock in various regions that influences migration inflow. This study offers three possible explanations. First, there is a unique dynamics between the Philippines' labor exporting policies and the willingness of Filipinos to migrate abroad for work makes the decision process on where to effectively work easier. Since it is encouraged by the Philippine government's development policies and due to also cultural Filipino mentality, regardless of the region of destination, as long as the work is overseas, labor migration is in line with the Filipinos and their government's policies of exporting labor. It fulfills the goals to be in a better working environment and at the same time the possibility of acquiring citizenship in the host country for long-term migrants. Second, the result may also be explained by the type of migrant work. For the first-time migrant workers who are dependent only on privately run agencies to find employment abroad, the destination is a secondary concern, next only to the economic gains, which is a potentially large income. If the migrant workers are more experienced and have access to better information about employment vacancies in the destination region, the reliance on private employment agencies for job abroad lessens or altogether vanishes. Finally, there is the internal character or attitude of Filipino labor migrant may play a role in deciding which region to settle in. The personal utility of the individual labor migrant could be the explanation for such behavior. For some labor migrants, having a network is the most important consideration to decrease the monetary and non-monetary cost of moving. Other migrants may consider the probability of employment more important than social connections. In conclusion, the results of this study provide a basis of for understanding the preferences and behavior of Filipino labor migrants migrating to Italy in response to the regional economic and geographical indicators. This study finds support and contradictions of the migration theories in explaining the inflow of Filipino labor migrants using different variables. The contrasting findings can be interpreted as either an indication of the new flourishing trend in labor migration flow among a very specific migrant population, or simply outliers in a relatively small migrant group. So first, the compilation of past and present findings regarding the drivers of migrations to Italy infers the existence of a cyclical pattern of reaction to different indicators over time. To recap, this study for the period of 2007 to 2017 confirms the findings of Salvatore between the periods of 1950 and 1960 regarding unemployment causing variances in regional migration. While the results of this research contradict with that of the similar study of Marcheri, whose scope is between 1985 and 2001. So for the housing cost indicator, contradictory findings are noted as well. Canari et al. Claims the housing cost is inherent to migration, while Edzo cites that it is in fact a significant determinant. This research is parallel with the former. The contradictory findings for the same geographical area but different periods of time support the inference of cyclical pattern. Second, the second conclusion is that the inflow of labor migrants responds differently to various variables. Between static and dynamic estimators, this paper finds that although the variations among regions influence Filipino labor migration flow, it is the variable type that significantly drives migration. So a demographic variable, which is the Filipino migrant stock, resulted to be the more significant in terms of influencing the inflow of labor migrants in both static and dynamic analysis. With that, I end my presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Magante, for the presentation. Let's go back to the presentation of Mr. Sherwin Toring, the call center industry, a destination for local migrant workers. The technical team, can you please share his slides? Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Sir Jade. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sige po. My apologies for the technical problem. Next slide, please. To begin, the employment opportunities that the industry is providing has been without a doubt a positive one. Based from what I've seen and experienced in the context of Cebu, the industry is hiring on a daily basis. However, how it actually affects certain individuals remains to be here. Moreover, since most of the contact centers and other subsectors of the BPO are physically scattered in metropolitan areas, Cebu, its impact then on those who are in the countryside or in the peripheries has not yet been fully explored. So this was actually the
Hello, Vivi. Sorry. So we'll just try to call Mr. Tori and connect him via audio connection. Yes. Can you try speaking, Sir Sherwin?
Hello po, can you hear me po?
Yes
We
po,
can hear.
so maybe you can proceed po.
Sige po. Are you currently presenting the slide, ma'am? Sharing the slide?
Yes.
Okay po. Yeah, as I was saying, most of the contact centers and other subsectors are physically clustered in major metropolitan areas such as Cebu, and its impact then on those who are living in the countryside has not yet been fully explored. So this was the takeoff point of the study. It was based from this context as to how the study was conceptualized. An exploratory study that originally attempted to look at how the industry was affecting those who are living in distant areas where there's a physical absence of the industry. And this was done by at least looking at it from the experiences and perspectives of the migrant workers who are present within the industry. So for my methodology, applying the principle of phenomenology, I conducted semi-structured interviews with 9 individuals who have come from different places, mostly from Visayas and Mindanao. Some of them came from Zamboanga, Tacloban, Bohol, and most of them are in their early to mid-20s at the time of the study. They also come from different educational backgrounds. Some of them were coming from education, communication, and one was came from marine transportation industry. Trixie, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I'm now on the results part.
Yes.
The interviews actually revolve on certain issues such as the reasons as to why they decided to work in the industry, and the challenges and adjustments that they had, and of course the impact of the industry or their employment to their lives. So for the reasons, I have categorized their responses into two. The first would be the immediate reasons. A couple of them, or a number of them, said that they were invited either by their friends or by their relatives. One of them was actually hired in their hometowns when the company where they are employed participated in a local job fair event held in their hometown. Now, a number of them also said that they decided to work in the industry and go to Cebu because they wanted to try a new environment. One was actually was a former teacher in DepEd and left her job there and eventually moved to Cebu to accordingly try a new environment, which she found in the industry. On the other hand, there were underlying reasons as to why they were forced to move out of their hometowns and work in the industry. One major issue from the majority of the participants was the issue on lower salary rates. A number of them have had work experiences back in their hometowns, but they decided to leave their first job for a higher pay, which was offered by the industry in Cebu. Now, for some of them, since many of them were fresh graduates and have had not any work experience, that prevented them to land on a job within their hometowns, because most of the requirements the requirements asked from them is the job experience, which they could not provide because they were mostly fresh grads. And one of them shared the issue on nepotism because accordingly when he was applying for a job in a government agency, and he said that he was more qualified because he had civil service, he passed the civil service exam, but then he didn't get the job, and the job was given to someone who was accordingly less qualified than him. So these factors have served as reasons for them to trigger them to move out of their hometowns and eventually move to Cebu and work in the industry. Now, for the challenges and adjustments, since the movement, physical movement of these individuals obviously pose some challenges and adjustments when they arrived in Cebu. And this can be seen from two different contexts. The first, there would be within their work environment. Common among the responses, among the participants, was the adjustments that they had to deal with, particularly with the time or schedule of the work, because they need to stay awake during nighttime, and this has actually also resulted into other issues, particularly on health. No, another aspect from where the challenge or the adjustments have to be made was with their work colleagues, because accordingly they have to work in a team, and usually a team is composed of culturally diverse individuals who may also be coming from different places, or who may be also migrant workers like them, and may be carrying different attitudes and cultural behaviors. So that was something that in a way demanded them to do some adjustments within their work environment. Another issue was on the mood of the customer. One of them said that hindi siya sanay na sinisigawan, no? And they usually, it's normal accordingly for a call center agent to encounter such customer, an irate customer. So this was something that also something that they have to adjust with when they came and were hired in the industry. And lastly, within their work environment, the type of account was also an important issue for one of them, because he was assigned in a financial account, which demanded some skills in finance. So this was something that also demanded for some other skills other than the linguistic skills. No? On the other hand, since they're in a new environment, in a new place in Cebu, the Cebu setting, the Cebuano setting has also caused some challenges for them as migrant workers. One major or common among all the participants was the issue on the cost of living in Cebu. Accordingly, the cost of living is higher than what they used to be spending back in their hometowns, and this becomes even more challenging for them, because since they're migrant workers, they could not afford to. What they do is they usually stay in boarding houses or in apartments, which forces them to spend more than a typical call center agent who lives as a local in Cebu. And in one case, the policy of the apartment may also force them to spend more, because, for example, one of them said that the owner of the apartment where she lives does not allow them to cook their own food within the room or within the apartment. So that forces them to buy their food and spend more. No? Another issue was on the traffic and transportation. On a speculative note, perhaps this became an issue for those who were living in barangays which were far away from the IT park, because there are places where they could stay within or around the IT park, but this could either be occupied already by agents, or could be more expensive because it's very near to their workplace. So this somehow forces some agents to look for a place which was quite far from the IT park or from their workplace, and that's probably the reason why traffic has become an issue for them. And also for those who are not who could not speak the Bisaya or the Cebuano language, that this has also become somehow in a way became a challenge for them, no? Especially considering that hindi madaling magtagalog sa Cebu, no? Because of the linguistic attitude against the Tagalog in Cebu. So this became an issue for them, for them. In the case of impact, I have also categorized this into three. The first there would be economic. Generally, in the economic sense, the impact of the employment was positive. A number of them said that, for example, one of them said that he was able to sustain his family. One of them also said that he was able to provide for his brothers and was able to send his brothers to school. And one of them also said that he was to renovate their house in his hometown. From the socio-emotional context, one of them said that she said that she get to familiarize with the culture of the Americans because she deals with the Americans almost every day. So there's a study in the literature that talks about spiritual migration happening within the industry, and this somehow is related to that, no? And another issue within the social emotional aspect was relationship with their families have waned, no, because of the distance. This has actually become also a challenge for some of them, the emotional challenge for some of them, because they live on their own. They live alone in Cebu, away from their families. And one of them said that the communication with their family has waned because what usually happens is that yung buhay niya is work. Then he needed to stay awake at night where his family are mostly tulog. Then during daytime, it's going to be the opposite. So there was a limited communication between him and his family who were in their hometowns. On the other hand, one of them also seemed to say the opposite because accordingly there was an improvement in her relationship with her family who were in Zamboanga in particular, no? Because accordingly her employment in the industry has allowed her to send money for her family in her hometown, and because of this, parang relationship with her family has improved. Unlike when she was still in her hometown and was then unemployed, so medyo pinapagalita siya or what, kasi hinila siya ng hingi or parang ganon yung idea. And then on a personal level, one of them expressed a change in their attitude. Like, for example, in this case, she used to be accordingly an introvert, but then when she started working within the industry, she has developed that interpersonal skills. And then a couple of them also said that they have learned to become more self-disciplined because they have to budget their own money. They need to spend for their food and do the budgetary stuff from their personal level, and because their parents were away from them. So that was something that was, I think, a positive thing on a personal level. So for the discussion and some personal reflections, the narratives of Agents 1, 5, and 9 suggest that indeed the call center is an easy industry. This has been common in the literature. It is easy for someone to get inside the industry because all you have, accordingly, that the basic requirement is the ability to speak in English. So in the case of Agent 9, his physical disability didn't hinder him from getting employed in the industry. In the case of Agents 1 and 5, who didn't have any work experience, that also didn't prevent them from being employed in the industry. Next, Agent 8's statements with regards to the nature of account or department where he was assigned also suggest that a certain degree of job mismatch exists within the industry. Although we perhaps many of us know this, that a lot of those who work within the industry are cases of job mismatch, as presented in earlier in the methodology, where most of their educational background didn't actually match with their job, you know. But but for some, as long perhaps for some, for as long as you can speak the English language, then there could be no mismatch there. But in the case of Agent A, it somehow shows that the ability to speak the English language is not enough, because the department where he was assigned required more than that. No, he had to have the basic skills in finance. And then lastly, the higher cost of living and the emotional distress caused by their movement away from their families or hometowns indicate that migrant call center agents experience challenges that are unique to them and perhaps on top of the ones commonly experienced by a typical call center agent. No? Perhaps there's a perception from some that mahirap yung trabaho because you have to stay awake at night. But the thing is, different groups of people within the industry may experience the challenges differently. There have been studies in the literature that suggest, for example, that women working in the industry experience more challenges than men. Also, there's also a similar study done in South Africa that suggests that your race and your class may also affect the kind of work or the how may affect how you will experience the work within the industry in general. So in this case, if you look at it from the perspective of a migrant worker, perhaps it might also be safe to say that being a migrant worker within the industry makes the job even more challenging. So with that, I'd like to say muchas gracias, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Tori. Thank you very much to all our presenters. We now move to the Q&A or question and answer portion. And again, I remind the participants to please send your questions in the chat box. Some questions have already been answered by our presenters. And so to start with the first question, the first question is directed to Dr. Canare. And Dr. Canare, are you here? Are you? Okay.
Hi, JV. Yes, I'm here.
Hello. Okay. So let me read the question. Beyond the discussion and understanding of vote buying and selling, which are illegal and immoral, what policy direction would you suggest to address it? This question is from Dr. Noel Asiones.
Yeah, well, that's always a difficult question to answer. But, well, I try to not give as much as possible, not provide motherhood statements. But for me, the solution is still twofold. One is to address the demand side and the supply side. On the demand side, I think information dissemination is still the best way. You have to inform the voters what the disadvantages or the adverse effects of vote buying and vote selling are. And there are many, and I don't want to enumerate them here to give time to other questions. So that's one, voter information dissemination and voter education. Now on the supply side, what we want to do is to strengthen the implementation of the law against vote buying. If the law is not being implemented, then there's always an incentive for candidates to buy votes. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, that's more that's easier said than done, because as the literature shows, vote buying is somehow already ingrained in the Philippine society. A lot of people accept it as something that's part of the elections. So if you have that kind of mentality or culture, then it's very difficult to implement the law against vote buying. But I think on the supply side, the best way to address it is still implementation or enforcement of the law against vote buying.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Canare. Let me just ask this question. Another question for Dr. Canare, but more on the methodology, I think. From Dr. Abigail Dumalos. How do you control for self-selection bias in the sample? What are the robustness checks implemented to ensure your findings are not mainly due to chance or unrelated factors? How do you minimize type 1 error?
Okay, so in selecting the respondents, we actually implemented a multi-stage random probability sampling. So our target was to interview low-income voters, and our service provider that we were able to hire for the survey, they have a list of what they call Class D and E communities in Metro Manila. Okay, and they have a list of this in from all 17 cities and municipalities in Metro Manila. So what we did was the first stage is sampling districts from each of the 17 cities and one municipality in Metro Manila. And then upon selecting the districts, we randomly selected the Class D and E communities in each of these districts, in each of these drawn districts. And then the last stage is systematic sampling, wherein you will go to each community, you're going to visit every N households. And for every refusal, you're going to proceed to the nth household. So it's a random sampling. Okay, there's really no sample selection except for uh, for the likelihood that the household would participate in the survey. So yeah, I hope I answered the question.
Thank you, Dr. Canare. Okay, our next question is addressed to Mr. Toring. And this question is from Mr. Rico Lavinia. Do you think working in the call center has had some kind of impact on their political attitudes or preferences? Mr. Toring?
Yeah. Sir JB, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
That would have been an interesting thing, no? But again, I'd like to emphasize that the study was written during the pre-pandemic context. It was actually written in 2017, and their preferences on political issues or political bets were not covered by the interview or by the interview. And I think, yeah, I really can't answer the question. Yeah. But that would have been an interesting thing. Perhaps do a follow-up, especially that some candidates have been, pushing for their rights and more privileges for the call center agents. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Toring. The next question is addressed to Dr. Magante. This is a follow-up from Dr. Racelis about the gender aspect. And she asks, why do you say surprisingly in discovering the gender differences? I think that is a follow-up question for your earlier answer as well.
Yes, because I've said earlier that I've studied the Filipino migrants, that's both female and male, and we saw that network externality has occurred, or at least for them. So I did a follow-up paper on that, which is under review in a journal, and the findings are currently the significant determinant for female Filipino labor migrants from Philippines to Italy would be the housing cost. I think it's significant because most Filipino labor migrants in Italy are working under the domestic side or employed domestically, and some of them we have classification. Some of them live with their employer. Some of them do not. So, as you may not know, the housing cost in Italy is currently under crisis. Mainly, one studio flat costs about 400 to 500 euros, which is about 36,000 in pesos. So I think that's the result of my current study, meaning Filipinas um would only or there's a high probability of Filipinas migrating to Italy if their housing cost is paid for. So meaning if their employment under the domestic side would be living with their employers for full time. So yeah, that's the difference between disaggregating male and female domestic.
Thank you, Dr. Magante. Um, since we don't have any more question, and we're running over time already, um, perhaps I can ask if Jeric wants to add anything about the question earlier that he answered already about the political dynasties, I think. Is that the yeah.
Well, I don't really have much more to add, but thanks for the prompt, JV. I think the important thing, and it's I think it's a point which Mary was also commenting on the chat is, and I think Tristan is right. The question of information is is crucial in terms of what voters choose to do. But then I also think maybe there seems to be this kind of tension which you get between voters who are becoming less dependent economically and thus more likely to be in their clientelistic relationships with political dynasties. And those voters who become, let's say, very prone either to populist voting. Because so that's also a kind of dynamic which I think still has to be threshed out in terms of political studies in the Philippines. We're still dealing with clientelism, but populism is also in the horizon. And I think we're not yet quite sure what's this trade-off that we're seeing. It seems like on one side we're breaking free from clientelism, not entirely. There's still a lot of it, but at the same time, it seems that as clientelism decreases in some areas, like if you see like Greater Manila, you also see a tendency towards populist voting. So that's a challenge which I think many of us are thinking about this upcoming election, 2022. It maps out very closely to the same fault lines when it came to 2016, at least from what I've observed.
Thank you, Jeric. So we now close our Q&A session. Thank you all to our presenters and to our participants for your active participation in our session. At this point, we would like to present the certificates of presentation to our presenters, and allow me to read the contents. The School of Social Sciences of the Ateneo de Manila University awards the Certificate of Participation to our paper presenters for their invaluable contribution during the 4th School of Social Sciences Research Conference with the theme Transitions, Transformations, and Transdisciplinarity, Doing Social Sciences in the Time of Disruptions and Accelerating Planetary Changes, held on 18 to 20 April 2022 by Zoom. This certificate is given on the 20th day of April 2022 in Quezon City, Philippines. The certificate will be signed by Dr. Pollack and Dean Salom Macedoni and will be sent to our paper presenters via email after the conference proper. Again, thank you very much and congratulations to all our presenters. To our participants, please answer our short evaluation form for the session. The link and the QR code are flashed on your screens right now. This will be the basis for tracking your participation in the conference. Only participants who were able to attend at least 3 sessions will be entitled to a certificate of attendance. Okay, While you are accomplishing the evaluation form, let me formally close this session 8 of the fourth School of Social Sciences Research Conference. Up next, we have session 9 with the theme Disentangling and Interrogating Empowerment. But before that, we will have a 10-minute break to allow everyone to rest for a bit or get some refreshments. We will be keeping this Zoom room open and playing some background music, and see you at 11 a.m. for the next session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, JV.
Good morning, and welcome to session 9 of the fourth School of Social Science um, Research Conference. I'm Angela Lorenzana from the Department of Communication of the Ateneo School of Social Sciences, and I will be your moderator for this session. Our session theme is Disentangling and Interrogating Empowerment. Before we begin, let me recap the house rules. If you encounter connection problems or get disconnected during the session, you may enter the conference room again by clicking the unique Zoom link sent to you via the conference registration confirmation email. Please ensure that your microphone is turned off during the conference to minimize background noise during the presentations. If your bandwidth allows, you are free to keep your camera turned on throughout the conference session. Please use the chat box on the right side of your screen for any comments or questions related to the session. These will be read during the Q&A portion to be facilitated by the moderator. Participants will not be allowed to raise their hand and unmute during the Q&A session. Lastly, we value respect and courtesy the most in our conference sessions. For this session, we have 4 paper presentations, and some will be doing recorded presentations. Each presentation is limited to 15 minutes only. I am instructed to inform speakers to wrap up in their final 2 minutes and stop the presentation should speakers go beyond the allotted time. Okay. So our first presentation is entitled Women Empowerment and COVID-19. How do women in fishing communities fare during a pandemic? Let's virtually welcome Cherilyn P. Labayo. It's a recorded presentation.
Good day, everyone. It is my honor to present my paper entitled Women Empowerment and COVID-19, How do Women in Fishing Communities Fare During a Pandemic? I am Cherilyn P. Labayo, instructor from Bicol University. One of the Sustainable Development Goals declared in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is the call to address women's empowerment. However, the promise of eliminating all barriers to women's empowerment remains unfulfilled. Here comes the COVID-19, reversing the limited progress made in decades. No one was spared. The crisis has impacted all segments of the population, especially the women fisher folks, who belong to the poorest and most vulnerable part of the society in most countries. Based on FAO statistics, women accounted for 14% of the 59.5 million people engaged in the primary sector of fisheries and aquaculture in 2018. However, when both the primary and secondary sectors are accounted, non-governmental organizations estimate that 1 out of 2 workers is actually a woman. This only shows that women in fisheries are significantly unrecognized and unvalued, as reflected by the near absence of gender disaggregated data on key social indicators and fisheries production. To fill this gap, this research sought to address positive data by specifically analyzing the conditions of women's empowerment in coastal communities during the COVID-19 in Bicol region. Particularly, the research aimed to describe the demographic and socioeconomic status characterizing the women respondents and explore the sources of disempowerment in the study area during the COVID-19 pandemic. For the methodology, 133 women from the coastal barangays in Sorsogon, Camarines Sur, and Masbate were selected using multi-stage sampling and purposive sampling. To measure women's empowerment, the study employed the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index questionnaire. Finally, using the data gathered from the instrument, the headcount ratio and sources of disempowerment were analyzed using the 5 domains of empowerment in agriculture. To give you a background, the 5 domains of empowerment in agriculture is composed of the following: decisions about the agricultural production, access to and decision making about productive resources, control of the use of income, leadership in the community, and time allocation. Each domain has corresponding indicators, and each indicator has a corresponding weight as shown in the table. The 5DE process starts with calculating the inadequacy scores. The individual responses to the survey instrument were assigned a value of 0 if the individual achievement falls below the defined inadequacy cutoffs for each of the 10 indicators. Otherwise, a value of 1 was given. The inadequacy score was then computed for each women respondent by summing the weighted inadequacies. The next step was identifying the disempowerment headcount ratio, after which the intensity of disempowerment is calculated. Then the product of the headcount and intensity of disempowerment becomes the disempowerment index across the 5 domains. Finally, the percentage contribution of each indicator to the overall disempowerment was also calculated. For example, under the indicator autonomy, a person is inadequate if the computed relative autonomy indicator is below 1. The other cutoff is the aggregation method. For this example, a person has demonstrated adequacy under the indicator autonomy if she has an achievement in any of the questions or sub-indicator. So here are the results of the study. The women respondents in the study area belonged to households with an average size of 5.6 members, with male household headship being practiced by the majority of the households. The average age was 44.5 years old across the study sites. Concerning educational attainment, most of them were elementary undergraduates. With regard to livelihood and income, the statistics showed that the women participants were engaged in various fishery-related livelihood activities, and from these livelihood activities, the women participants reported a monthly contribution to the household income of 3,383 pesos on average. As to the result of the 5DE, only 21% of the women respondents were empowered. This means that about 79% of the women respondents are not yet empowered. Empowerment of the remaining 79% who are not yet empowered can be increased in areas concerning autonomy in production, input to productive decisions, purchase, sale, or transfer of assets, and the workload, because these indicators posted the highest contribution to overall disempowerment. While ownership of assets and leadership in the community did not contribute to the source of disempowerment in the area, and women in the study maintained the joint decisions about the use of money, they tend to have less control over economic decisions concerning agricultural production. For example, women in the study tend to have less or no participation in decisions concerning what types of crops to grow or when and who would take fish to the market because they feel that it is the role of men in the household. Hence, decisions made by the women in the household were less autonomous because of social norms on gender roles. Full ownership alone is not empowering. Instead, having the right to control over the purchase, sale, and transfer of assets can also increase empowerment. However, as with the input in productive decisions and autonomy in production, women in the study area hardly participated in decisions to buy and dispose of an asset owned by the household. While experiencing hardships in livelihood, many women found themselves juggling unpaid reproductive work with underpaid productive work. In the study site, women are found working for 6 to 8 hours on average, attending to domestic and reproductive care work. This included child rearing, caring for the old household members, and household maintenance like cooking and fetching water. On the other hand, productive work constituted 2 to 6 hours on average of women's workload, which involved low value addition activities like fish processing and less profitable work like the mending of nets. These prevented women in the study area from enjoying leisure activities and engaging in meaningful activities that will advance their capabilities and full potential as members of society. So these are the multiple interconnected factors that leave women in the coastal communities in Bicol region at a great disadvantage to fully engage and benefit from market opportunities. Underlying these patterns of inequity are cross-cutting challenges amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic. These factors identified as major sources of disempowerment include lack of access to and control over assets, constraining gender norms in making economic decisions on production, and time and labor burdens. Advancing women empowerment means proactively placing women on par with men in designing socio-economic plans. Social safety nets should give intentional focus to low-income women and women-headed households. Such response efforts require support for data innovations, for timely, quality, and gender disaggregated data for women in fisheries. More importantly, social support and knowledge sharing should be strengthened by investing on organizations empowering women at the grassroots. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ms. Labayo. Now we have our second presentation, which is actually entitled The Digital Divide Among Women Slum Dwellers During the Pandemic. This is a presentation by Dr. Violet B. Valdez and Ms. Samantha Javier.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Lorenzana. May I share my screen now?
Yes po, ma'am. Go ahead.
I think someone. All right. This will stop others. Okay. I think I should go ahead.
Interrupt to the current screen share, ma'am.
Okay. So, what is this? Okay. Anyway. Okay. So. Okay. This everyone see my screen? Is it
Yes po,
is it
we can
fine?
see your
Yes,
screen.
it's clear.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you so much. So thank you for this opportunity to present a study which is in a sense in progress, but we'd like to present to you the initial findings of our study, which we have just concluded. So that was titled this Digital Divide Among Slum Dwellers During the Pandemic. My co-author, Samantha P. Javier, could not be here, unfortunately, but she's doing another very important thing, which is campaigning full time for someone we know, I guess. So let's see. We are witnessing the first great pandemic of the digital age set against the backdrop of a worsening digital divide. Without the pandemic, the digital divide already disadvantages individuals and groups who are located at the deficit side of the divide. It is reasonable to expect that the pandemic would pose an aggravation. In this presentation, we report the results of a study that examined first the digital divide in the situation of women dwellers in the slum area in the Manila metropolis during the pandemic, and second, the ways in which the women appropriated information and communication technologies, or ICTs, especially the internet in everyday life during the pandemic. The digital divide refers to the disparities and inequalities in access, skills, and knowledge of information and communication technologies, which lead to differentials in use, opportunities, and benefits or consequences. The consequences of the digital divide are manifested in the differentials in the quality and quantity of participation and performance in educational, political, social, and economic activities. Limited access to digital technologies generally implies limited access to services, resources, and information, and their potential benefits. Digital inequalities were starkly evident during the COVID-19 pandemic, when ICTs became the dominant tool of communication, interaction, business, education, interpersonal relations, and participation in social life. Especially during the recurring lockdown periods, there was hardly any alternative to the use of ICTs to deal with even the most mundane tasks. Hence, lack of access to ICT worsened the material and social deprivation of the poor during the COVID-19 pandemic. Being digitally disadvantaged put the poor more at risk to contract the virus itself and to suffer from negative consequences related to this crisis overall. Digital inequalities during the pandemic are exacerbated along a number of factors, including physical and material access to ICT. For instance, the speed of connections are dependent on the features of digital gadget and the speed of internet connection, the number of persons connecting to the internet, and so on. Okay, studies of individual and household digital divides show that the digital divide occurs along social demographic lines such as gender, age or generation, education, income, employment status, and ethnicity. Gender is one of the most important individual level determinants of ICT inequalities. Gender-based inequalities in low-income socioeconomic settings have been attributed to various factors, including unequal access to education among young women, leading to their low literacy levels, limited institutional opportunities to access ICTs, personal safety issues, and the leaky pipeline phenomenon, that is the gender difference in individuals' aspirations, where women tend to rank work-life balance, parenthood-related issues, and their family's welfare as more important than men do. These obstacles are perpetuated by structural factors such as extreme poverty and highly patriarchal societies and psychological barriers such as limited confidence among women in their capacity to learn ICT skills, and the belief that technology is reserved for their male counterparts. In general, research on digital inequalities, especially its occurrence among poor populations, in, is infrequent in countries of the global south. Research on underprivileged communities and their interest practices, such as this one, what we have done, we hope should present data that could challenge dominant assumptions and conceptualizations, in particular those developed within affluent contexts and the context of the global north. As mentioned earlier, we examined the digital inequalities experienced by women dwellers in the slum area along the dimensions of access, digital skills, and usage. And we look into the ways into which the women appropriated the internet and integrated it into the routines of everyday life. To examine digital inequalities, we employ the conceptualization of the digital divide as a phenomenon that involves differentials in physical and material access, digital skills, and usage. To look into how the internet was appropriated for everyday life by this unique user population, we use the conceptualization of ICTs as meaningful tools bearing social value and as a meaningful phenomenon that exists only in a particular place. The social value of ICT is brought about through conscious acts of configuration, mediation, and active interpretation by social actors. Our study was exploratory and as such intended to uncover broad trends and patterns of behavior through a focused engagement with a small sample of women. The study area is Rona's Garden, one of 5 slum communities in Barangay Loyola Heights in Quezon City. If you are from Ateneo and you tend to move around, then you might have noticed, you might know about Rona's Garden. Typically, with slum areas, they exist side by side with affluence, and so it is with Rona's Garden. The boundaries of Rona's Garden are defined by the peripheries of upscale gated communities such as Xavierville 1, 2, and 3. It can be reached from the main street, Esteban Abada Street, through a narrow passageway about 1.5 meters wide. It's about the height of a basketball player and 25 meters in length. So Esteban Abada, if you might know, if you're in the air from the area, Esteban Abada is parallel to Katipunan, the street along which Ateneo finds itself. The land of the land occupied by Rona's Garden, it belongs to Meralco. In one study, Rona's Garden has been described as the area with the worst condition among the slum areas in Barangay Loyola Heights. We conducted in-depth interviews with follow-ups of 10 women who met the following criteria. They were residents of Rona's Garden, had a family of their own, they had access to a smartphone. The synchronous video interviews were conducted via Messenger. Just a brief background about slum dwellings. Slum areas like Rona's Garden are prevalent in the Philippines, in the country. In 2010, it was estimated that 37% of the population of Metro Manila, or over 4.4 million, live in slums. In Quezon City, 20.6% of the city's 634,436 households live in slum areas. The statistics from 2018. In other words, every 5 person you meet in Quezon City is a slum dweller. Many of the grab riders, security guards, waiters, massage persons we meet in Quezon City are dwellers of slum communities. The 10 women study participants aged 22 to 42 years old were living in extended families consisting of the husband, children, and other relatives, typically siblings and parents. Their daily income ranged from a low of 100 pesos per day to quite a high of about 800 pesos per day. Those women who had very little income, in other words, those who belong to very poor households or to poor households, typically were engaged in casual jobs, not to augment the family income. They typically work as household help, as vendors selling flowers and other goods at the Santa Clara Church, which is not far from there, from Rona's Garden, as calaqueros or calaqueras, in other words, gatherers of scraps, trash, and recyclable materials, or as producers of eco bricks. Those are building blocks made of solid non-recyclables. The pandemic brought greater hardship, in particular, to their families as they lost their sources of income due to the economic lockdown. establishments such as restaurants and offices, which are the sources of the scraps, shut down. Santa Clara Monastery stopped holding religious services, and so they could not sell flowers to pilgrims. Affluent families confined themselves to their bubbles and dreaded to employ casual household help. Schools shifted to online learning, so there were no clients for tricycles and hawker food, laundry, and so on. The women's struggle for struggle for subsistence is mirrored the way they manage their ICT needs. At the time of data gathering, which is last month, 9 women had a mobile phone and 1 had a tablet, all of which had internet capability. No one had a desktop or laptop computer. 4 of the women did not have a digital device when the health crisis, when the pandemic broke out. They acquired it only in 2021, which was the second year of the pandemic. And they had to acquire it, they said, because they had to make sure that their children continued schooling. That was when blended learning, the public schools began. Indeed, ICT as expense item had the least priority in the women's limited budget. Since buying a phone would cut a significant chunk from the women's income, the women either bought their phone on installment basis or these were lent to them by relatives or friends. The relative or neighbor who lent gadgets specifically said they were doing it to enable the women's children to attend online learning classes. Indeed, a strong motivation to acquire an internet-ready gadget arose from the desire to see their children continue their schooling. And as Philippine schools shifted to various forms of distance learning starting 2021, and this included blended learning. As one research participant remarked, inutang po ng asawa ko sa trabaho po niya, kasi kailangan mag-online ng anak ko. And that was how they had to acquire a digital device. A recognition of the primacy of the children's education was also the motivation behind the social support that the women obtained so they would acquire access to ICT. Shared ownership of an ICT device within the household was the norm, as most of the women live in households which had only one ICT device. They shared the ICT, that's the mobile phone or the tablet, with their husbands and children. So a participant described her situation as follows: kaming dalawa at mga anak ko ang mga gumagamit. Wala akong sariling cellphone. Shared phone po sa buong pamilya. Sa ngayon, ako ang madalas gumamit kasi may online ako. Walang cellphone ang asawa ko. Nakikitext siya sa iba. The women had priority claim for use of the mobile phone because they had to supervise and assist their children who were learning online from home. Among the women, it was, as to connectivity, among the women, it was wanting to have access to a digital device, and quite another to have uninterrupted access to internet services. Intermittent and limited access was the access to the internet characterized the women's internet access because they did not have sufficient means to purchase prepaid, much less postpaid services that would give unlimited, uninterrupted access for a long period of time. The most affordable and hence the preferred mode of use is prepaid data service. The women usually bought prepaid cards for 50 pesos, which gave about 3 days of access. Once the card has been used up, they would buy a new prepaid subscription right away if they had the money. If they did not, they abstained from the internet for as long as it took for them to afford a new card, even if it meant online. Being offline meant that their children would not attend online classes. As a last resort, some of the women use public access ICT devices. These are the PisoNet. Let me see. These are the PisoNet and Piso Wi-Fi devices that sell internet services on retail. These offer much affordable and yet less convenient access to the internet. PisoNet and Piso Wi-Fi devices are vending machines. How much time do I still have, Dr. Lorenzana?
You still have 2 minutes.
I just have 2 minutes. Okay. And okay, good. So I'll rush up. Okay, let me see. I was showing, I think, okay. So I was talking about the PisoNet and Piso Wi-Fi devices, which women use as a last resort. In general, the data suggests that contextual experiences such as income levels and living arrangements are important to understanding the methods which the women of Ron's Garden use to gain internet access during the period of prolonged isolation and social distancing necessitated by the period of prolonged isolation and social distancing during the pandemic. Now, as to technical skills is also one of the dimensions of the digital divide. The use of ICT is premised on a person's possession of a specific set of skills to achieve one's purposes. The women had the technical skills to operate their phones, to use a number of apps. Above all, the women access the internet for the education of their children. A popular tool is Zoom, which they use for their children's classes, and also to attend a reflection and sharing activity organized by a charismatic Christian group, and to chat with family members, especially those who live out of town. As the women scrimped on their prepaid data services, they restricted their activities to those which they consider as most valuable, which is the education of their children. Access to online alternatives to public services as healthcare, such as healthcare information work opportunities, were rarely explored. This finding shows how digital inequalities can put already disadvantaged groups at greater risk as a result of diminished social contact during a pandemic. Now, may I just get quickly to the conclusions. The bare bones ICT access of the women were of tremendous value during the pandemic. Most importantly for the women, through ICT, their children were able to attend online classes. The women also used the devices to communicate with their extended families and social network, to find solutions to everyday problems, such as doing business and seeking medical help, to take part in life support activities like sharing and reflection sessions in church services. As such, the women appropriated the ICTs for everyday life in many meaningful ways during the pandemic. The internet afforded the women a space for familiar connectivity, for the enactment of their aspirations, their core values. Not least, it provided them a crutch for their daily struggles, if they found there a space for sharing experiences of uplifting, optimism, community building, and suffering from persistent structural inequality. Ultimately, in spite of access limitations, the internet provided the women of Rona's Garden a meaningful tool for coping and survival during the pandemic. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Valdez and Ms. Samantha Javier. Our third presentation is entitled hashtag Break the Bias, UN SDG and Socio-Theological Pandemic Response from a Gender Lens. This is a presentation by Maria Maricel S. Ibita and Maria Marilu S. Ibita. Please welcome our presenters.
Good day to all. Due to digital divide, I will be sharing my screen with you on our recorded presentation. Good day to all. Today we present Break the Bias, UNSDG and Socio-Theological Pandemic Response from a Gender Lens. Urban poor communities are not just a problem in today's world, they are part of the solutions. Dr. Mary Rosella shared this insight in her discussion of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 1, No Poverty, Urban Poor Community Research Partner. This is how we break the bias, the 2022 International Women's Day theme, as we globally build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic. We need the UN SDGs even more.
We combine the theological pastoral spiral or CJEG method used in basic ecclesial communities and the hiyang sociological approach by Teresita Ubusan. To see, ask the question you see on the screen. We merge it with pakiramdaman, which uses all our senses and acknowledges our initial intuition over matters or persons, resulting in sensing. We sense the socioeconomic issues that the APOAM face during the COVID-19 pandemic. Judging means socio-theological analysis. We use usap-usapan or everyday small talk which seeks to know how the people are. Data comes from kwento at kasulatan or the narratives of the groups in songs, dances, myths, legends, and write-ups about them. Deeper awareness makes this step therapeutic and empowering. The APOAM's core narratives and the Syrophoenician story dialogue here. To act is effective response with damay at pakikiisa, the inner dispositions of solidarity in words and actions. We cultivate this through our community knowledge and skills learning on UNSDG and citizen journalism. Latin Americans added evaluate to assess the effectiveness of the discerned action. As nilay tasa, it includes introspection such as the triumphs and challenges of the Apuamp and the Seraphonician. The Bolivians included to celebrate, to express divine gratitude. Since celebrar connotes happy memories, we include ritualization too, because we also need to symbolically integrate limits, failures, challenges through laments. In our pakikisang diwang ritual, we share a poem by our current Apo president. The spiral continues as it seeks liberation and transformation. One sense. Why are they more emotional today? We silently asked while discussing our talab activity last year. They refers to the leaders and members of the APUAMP who shared their COVID-19 experience of job loss, poor online learning, difficulty in implementing health protocols, low water supply, and the sewer's bad smell which made the lockdown unbearable. The Apo community is a communal break the bias story. The organized residents live along the danger zone of the Mangahan River in Pasig. In 2009, Typhoon Ondoy Katsana severely devastated them. They could not return to their homes. Since the relocation offer was far from their jobs and the utilities were not good, the community formed the Apo to legally seek in city housing. The community organizers Multiversity or COM helped them through participative planning and strategies drop the people's plan. At our stakeholders meeting last year, the APOM community prioritized UNSDG 5, 1, 3, 4, and 16. As theologians, we thought that the socio-pastoral cycle can be enriched by feminist biblical characterization, and the Syrophoenician woman can serve as a spiritual companion. To judge. At the Talab Forum, their emotional sharing was caused by the news that a family of 9 tested COVID positive. The UPOMP leaders with us had to act fast to contain the outbreak while protecting those sick with basic needs. While the government's highly militarized approach made life more difficult for poor, especially the women, the UPOMP's COVID response grew from their core kwento at kasulatan, like this 2018 anniversary message of VP Lenny Robredo. Architect Maui's aptly titled article, When God Wills the People's Plan, tells us that cooperation with the religious actors as well in achieving the UN SDGs widens its discussion and gathers other organized actors to achieve them fully and multisectorally so we can build a better post-pandemic global community. Here, the Syrophoenician from Mark 7 can be a dialogue partner. Let's closely read Mark 7 in dialogue with the Apoam community by asking the Megan McKenna questions for a critical reading of text, including the Bible. 1. How do you feel to personalize the story? 2. What's true in the story to universalize the story? And 3. What is disturbing in the story to facilitate critical engagement and generate alternative insights? Let's focus on the disturbing part of the story. Most people accept Jesus' initial discriminating response against the Syrophoenician woman. Some criticize the woman for challenging Jesus. Others cheer her persistence to break the bias to get her daughter healed. Let's analyze the text more critically by asking these characterization questions on the Syrophoenician woman. 1. What does the character say? 2. What does the character do? 3. What do other actors say to, about, or against the focus character? 4. What do other actors do to, for, or against the focus character? These questions scrutinize the character and the dynamics operative in the story. Let's now characterize the Syrophoenician who dared Jesus to break the bias and see how she can accompany our Apo women today. The violet colors show how the narrator and Jesus describe the woman. One, for the narrator, she has a little daughter with an unclean spirit, a Gentile, a Syrophoenician. For Jesus, she is compared to dogs, but because of her immediate riposte, her daughter was healed. Thus, she has intersecting identities. Let's see how determined the Syrophoenician woman is. Her green font actions show that even if Jesus did not want anyone to know where he was, she immediately heard about him. She came and bowed down at his feet. The pink flea begs Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter. When Jesus challenged her by saying that he cannot grant his wish because she's an outsider and even compared her and her daughter to dogs, she immediately gave her riposte. Her witness beat Jesus in his own game within their cultural boundaries, resulting in Jesus' long distance healing of the Syrophoenician's daughter. So she went home, found her child lying on the bed with a demon gone. So, how insistent was the woman? The green font actions show that even if Jesus was hiding, she immediately heard about him. She came and bowed down at his feet. The pink plea begs Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter. Jesus says challenge that he cannot grant her wish because she's an outsider and even compared them to dogs, but she instantly gave her riposte. Her sharpness beat Jesus in his own game within their cultural boundaries, resulting in the girl's healing. So she went home, found her child lying on the bed with the demon gone. So what's their similarities? One, their words and actions articulated the problems. Two, their words and actions broke the biases and facilitated the solutions, healing, and public housing through the People's Plan and pandemic help. And third, they both knew whom to ask for help, Jesus and partnership with government and NGO. In so doing, the Syrophoenician's daughter was healed and the Apo can now work on their preferred UN SDGs. Third, act. For Kilos Damay, Upward Up partners with the Asian Center for Journalism to equip Apo with knowledge and skills in citizen journalism. It is based on the notion that the public can play an active role in the process of correcting, reporting, analyzing, and disseminating information. In this case, the APOAM realizes that their advocacies and actions are already part of the UN SDGs. Here's a sample minutes of meeting on CJ workshops, insights, benefits, and correlations. We can return to them when we have time. 4. Evaluate. As seen earlier, the Syrophoenician can accompany our UPAM community to achieve the UN SDGs. How? In the New Testament, characters like Jesus and the Syrophoenician lived poorly under the Roman Empire. UPAM's no poverty actions include access to government's unemployment aid, ayuda distribution, cloth face mask sewing and selling, and urban gardening. As the Roman imperial context included an unhealthy, socially conflictual environment that made people suffer, Jesus' healing of the Syrophoenician's girl shows him overcoming these expressions of social conflict. Her resolve led to Jesus' healing ministry to the Gentiles and women. Apoam, goal number 3, supported infected members, acupuncture training, coordination to increase water supply, and fixing of the smelly sewage for a more tolerable lockdown. The Syrophoenician provides Jesus a teaching moment by subverting the dog metaphor to her advantage. For Apoam, quality education is seen in community learnings on the UN SDG and spirituality as a resource for advocacy. Online learning support as Pasig gave tablets for students and consultation on modular learning. Costly yet weak internet data remains a challenge. Fourth, the Syrophoenicians' wit and persistence challenged the discrimination on healing based on ethnicity, religion, and gender pervasive at the time. By defeating Jesus in the challenge repose, the daughter was healed and Jesus expanded his identity and healing. This aspect shows the need for critical rereading of Bible characters when their actions are disturbing for today's standards. APOAM's communal identity was also tested as some members resisted quarantine health protocols. SDG 16 is fortified by APOAM's estate management response through community agreed COVID 19 protocols. The Upward Up researchers also heeded their call to learn more about women leadership and gender lens on advocacies. So now they are initially discussing how to rearticulate APOAM's vision mission using SDG language. 5. Celebrate, ritualize. Here is Miss Lelaine Suarez's reflection on women leadership. Conclusion. Through combined Teo-Socio approach to break the bias, we have seen how the Syrophoenician and the Apo-Amp women can journey together to bring healing and sustainability. Indeed, multidisciplinarity leads to multisectoral transformation so that the UN SDGs are achieved as we transition to a better post-COVID world where women and urban poor communities are dynamic partners. Thank you.
Um, Thank you very much, okay, for the presentation. Okay. Now we proceed to the final paper in the group. Okay. The title is The Grouper Culture in the Bicol Region, Philippines, Challenges and Opportunities. Okay. By Emmanuel M. Prenia and Cherilyn P. Labayo.
Magandang araw po sa lahat. First of all, I'd like to thank the conference organizers for accepting our abstract. My name is Mr. Emmanuel M. Prenya, and together with me in this paper is Cherlyn P. Labayo. We are both faculty members of the Bicol University Center for Policy Studies and Development. Our research is entitled The Grouper Culture in the Bicol Region, Philippines, Challenges and Opportunities. This study focused on evaluating the grouper culture farming in Dagay and the Gallego Communes, Philippines as a livelihood project intervention. In the Bicol region, Communes was the leading producer of grouper in terms of volume from aquaculture, with 75% of regional production from 2017 to 2019. The Grouper Culture Project is aimed primarily to improve household income and eventually contribute to the reduction of poverty of the grouper farmers. Further, this intervention also seeks to empower women and fishing households. The grouper culture was a livelihood development project under the Fisheries, Coastal Resources and Livelihood Project, or Fish Coral, of DAB FAR from 2016 to 2020, which was funded by the International Fund for Agriculture, or IFAD. Most of the farm sites in the study only started in 2019. This study evaluated the grouper culture in the two municipalities where the marine cages are located. Specifically, the study analyzed the socio-demographic characteristics of grouper fishing households and the assessment of their livelihood capital assets. This study also assessed the achievements and results of the grouper culture project from the standpoint of grouper farmers and other relevant stakeholders. This study covered the grouper culture farm sites in Ragay and Del Gallego, Camarines Philippines. Three farm sites were covered in Ragay, and these are located in the barangays of Catabangan, Lower Umon, and Buenasuerte. In Del Gallego, on the other hand, the farm sites covered are situated in the barangays of Magais 1 and Sabang. This study employed both qualitative and quantitative methods of data collection and inquiry. The research methods used were review of secondary documents, semi-structured interviews with the grouper farmers, key informal interviews with focal persons from the municipal agriculture offices of the two municipalities, and community facilitators from DABFAR. Of course, we also had focus group discussions with Fisher Folk Association members. The grouper farmers were purposely selected as they were directly engaged in the operation of the grouper fish cages and as beneficiaries of the livelihood intervention. A total of 43 gopher farmers were interviewed across the farm sites. The data collected on socio-demographic characteristics were analyzed using descriptive statistics. To analyze the livelihood asset profile of households, the study adopted the livelihood assets framework developed by the Department for International Development or DFID. For the analysis of women's empowerment, on the other hand, the study adopted the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index developed by International Food Policy Research Institute. WEA measures women's five domains of empowerment within their households and communities. The five domains are agricultural production, resources, income, leadership, and time. This study also adopted the five evaluation criteria by the Development Assistance Committee of the Economic Cooperation and Development in evaluating the project performance. These evaluation criteria are relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability. Let us now come with an analysis of the socio-demographic characteristics of the households of grouper farmers. The household socio-demographic profile of the grouper farmers revealed that more than half of their total household members were the economic productive ages. The study also identified that 60.6% of the household members were considered dependent, of which over 50% of the dependents were children. This figure was relatively higher than the national age dependency ratio of 55.2% in 2020. The high dependency ratio in gopher fishing households indicates a burden for the economically active population in meeting the social needs of the dependents. However, the young population may provide a window opportunity when they advance to the working ages. Meanwhile, the grouper farming households consist of an average of 5 persons, which was relatively bigger than the national average of 4 family members. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, according to grouper farmers, was somehow manageable because the national and the local government units provided them with social assistance or safety nets in the form of cash transfers in the provision of free commercial feeds. However, they considered the impact of the three consecutive typhoons to be extreme. Among the capital assets that were severely impacted by the typhoons was the natural capital. It was expected given that the locations of their floating fish cages, which are prone to storm surges. As a result, two out of the farm sites discontinued their cage operations. The farmers also experienced water shortages, which increased the burden on their time for sourcing drinking water. In addition, their dwellings and crops were also destroyed by the typhoons, which made them more at risk of poverty. The impacts on natural capital had a causal sequence on their financial capital because their sources of income from fishing and crop farming were lost. During the assessment period, 5 months after the last typhoon, the physical assets were restored to their pre-shock condition. Their dwellings were reconstructed. The water supply had been restored, although some of them were purchasing their water from the water refilling stations. The communication and power had also been restored and transport routes were reestablished. The only assets that did not appear to be impacted by the typhoons were human and social capital. The evaluation of gopher farmers to their respective FOs or fisher folk associations or organizations provided them with informal safety nets in coping with shocks, particularly through credit assistance. Let us now proceed with the evaluation findings of the achievements and results of the Grouper Culture Project from the standpoint of grouper farmers and other relevant stakeholders. These stakeholders may include the field personnel of LGUs and the DABFAR Regional Office 5. The first evaluation criterion is the relevance, which answers the question of, is the intervention doing the right things? The Grouper Culture Project was formulated in the context of the overall goal of the fish corral to reduce poverty incidence in coastal communities, improve food and nutrition security, and increase household incomes of the fishers. This goal is also aligned with the priority policies of the current Philippine Development Plan in the Sustainable Development Goals or SDGs of reducing poverty and promoting women's empowerment. Thus, this livelihood intervention was relevant in the context of this evaluation criteria. The next evaluation criterion is effectiveness. This answers the question of, is the intervention achieving its objectives? This criterion is the most difficult to achieve because of multidimensional challenges in the implementation. Although only three FOs continued their cage operations after the first cycle, the beneficiaries across FOs testified of the learnings they gained in the operation of cages. The main drawback of the project was that it is dependent on natural resource base that is susceptible to natural shocks and seasonality. There were accounts from the farmers of their observations during the project's implementation. For instance, the farmers reported a high mortality rate of grouper fry. They also observed that the stock groupers were not accustomed to eating commercial feeds. They resolved this problem by mixing the commercial feeds with trash fish or relying heavily on the latter. Relying on solely on trash fish as an alternative fish meal for groupers is an additional cost. Besides, the technical trainings provided to a few members of FOs after the cage materials were awarded can be a good starting point. However, it should have continued with the other supplemental trainings. As a result, the production, particularly during the first cycle, was adversely affected, resulting in a few harvests due to high mortalities and diseases. The harvest might be fewer if the FOs had no members without prior experience in grouper culture. In addition, natural events were considered as the main culprit of not achieving the project's objectives. For instance, in the last quarter of 2020, three strong typhoons directly hit the Bicol region, which brought so many destructions. All fish cages were wholly and partially damaged, killing the groupers inside the cages. Another natural shock that negatively affected the livelihoods of the farmers was the COVID-19 pandemic, which negatively influenced the farm gate price of live groupers. Thus, there was no clear evidence of whether the livelihood interventions has achieved its desired results due to shortcomings in the intervention's implementation. The next evaluation criterion is efficiency. Efficiency is the extent to which the intervention delivers results in an economical and timely way. Given the limitations of studies, such as the absence of financial statements, particularly for grouper culture from the implementing unit, efficiency cannot be established wholly. However, questions about the availability of inputs, on-time delivery, and in the right quantities and quality can be answered. Accordingly, most of the inputs necessary for grouper culture production were provided for free and delivered on time to respective FOs by DVFAR and its fish corral community facilitators, except for the delivery of commercial feeds which were delayed because of the community quarantines in 2020. The operational efficiency that looks into how well the intervention was managed in general was well considered. The role of fishers as recipients of the projects has become the driving force of their livelihood strategies. The role sharing of DBFAR, Fish Corral, and the LGUs was regarded as significant in the project's implementation. The next criterion of the evaluation is the impact, which investigates the difference the intervention makes. There was no indication yet that the project generated remarkable changes to the beneficiaries, as it requires reliable baseline information. Although the impact cannot be realized at this point, it is possible to consider some preliminary conclusions concerning the potential impact of the project. In terms of household income, their average monthly income derived from all sources was 8,908.26. This is relatively lower than the national and regional average. In addition, their income was not yet attributable to the project since the sources vary. The mean contribution from grouper farming to total household income was roughly 9% only. With this level of income, the smallest farmers in the present survey contained higher proportions of poor households than the national, regional, and provincial averages. Besides, their income tend to be lower than their consumption expenditure. Hence, households cannot meet their material wants and basic needs. Another major goal of this intervention was to achieve women empowerment in the fishing households. Results showed that there's still high proportion of women who were disempowered at 63.16%. Out of 10 domain indicators, 7 contributed to women's disempowerment. These were autonomy in production, purchase, sale, or transfer of assets, input in productive decisions, workload, access and decisions on credit, speaking in public, and leisure. The last criterion of the evaluation is sustainability, which is mainly concerned with continuing the benefits of grouper culture even after the termination of the project. The evaluation found that the intervention had not met its objectives of reducing poverty in most grouper farmers. Hence, sustainability can be uncertain for now. However, it is more likely to achieve sustainability for those FOs that continue their cage operations if the effects of the pandemic subside and no threats from natural calamities. As to the conclusions of this study, the grouper farmers live in challenging socioeconomic conditions and were extremely vulnerable to natural shocks. The impact of the pandemic on their livelihood was perceived to be manageable. However, the impact of the typhoons was extreme, resulting in destruction of their fish cages, dwellings, and crops. These extreme events made them more at risk of poverty. Natural assets were hit the hardest by the typhoons, forcing some FOs to halt operations. Despite income and livelihood disruptions, some grouper farmers remained positive to continue their cage operations. Although the grouper culture project was found relevant, its effectiveness, efficiency, impact, and sustainability were still uncertain due to uncontrolled shortcomings in the implementation. After the project's inception, the evaluation confirmed that its poverty reduction objectives did not materialize. While the intervention provided self-employment for grouper farmers, its contribution to total household income was meager. The participation of many groupers was distracted after their experiences during the first cycle because of the following: 1. High mortality rates of grouper; 2. Low production; 3. Insufficient knowledge of members; 4. Natural calamities; and 5. The pandemic. The evaluation also found a very high proportion of women grouper farmers who were disempowered. Based on the findings of this study, we came up with these recommendations. First, livelihood interventions must consider not only the livelihood assets and strategies of households, but also the external environment such as shocks and seasonality. Second, a package of capacity building and development for grouper farmers must be provided to make them more resilient even in the face of vulnerabilities and contingencies. And lastly, a future evaluation is necessary to document the gains and lessons learned from the current project implementation for possible replication and modification of future related projects. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much for the presentations. Okay. Now we can entertain questions and comments from the audience. Okay. We have actually questions initially uploaded on the chat box, and if I may start, okay. There's one from Ms. Marisol Ibita, and this is addressed, I think, to the first presentation by Ms. Labayo. Let me read the question. May I ask if the women in the fishing villages are members of organizations or cooperatives to develop their leadership and decision-making capacities?
Thank you for that question, Ms. Ibita. Yes, actually, most of the women respondents in the area were members of fisher folk organizations. That is why leadership, as one of the dimensions of empowerment, did not contribute to the disempowerment. The women in the study area were able to express their thoughts through meetings where they talk about the projects being implemented by their organization. However, they are underrepresented in terms of number, unless the organization is a women's organization. So, but another saddening fact is that they do not have much power in terms of decision making concerning household matters, unless it is about the use of income.
Thank you so much, Ms. Labayo. So for now, I think we only have a question and a comment. We have a follow-up question here, still from Ms. Ibita, addressed to Ms. Labayo. The question is, did you also interview those who do not belong to cooperatives? Is there any difference in the data?
Actually, I did not. That was not part of the study to establish a significance difference between the women respondents who were not part of the organization and those who were part of the organization. But this is a very good question, and I would like to take into consideration this when I revisit the data. Thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you. Right. So, yes, I think if you have questions, you can just type them up here in the chat box. And then you may also want to ask the question, okay, using the microphone here on Zoom, okay. So in the meantime, let me just read out the comment from Professor Racelis on the presentation of Dr. Valdez. I think this merits a kind of attention. So according to Professor Racelis, who has conducted many researches and who has been part of urban poor communities, okay. From her experience, she's saying urban informal settlements with organized POs, of which people's organizations, of which there are many in Metro Manila, show that the mostly women leaders have learned how to transform their cell phones into interactive instruments for mobilizing communities. For example, in fair ayuda distribution, in setting up economic opportunities, in mobilizing protest groups to LGUs. Okay. So they now master Zoom and Facebook meetings to develop and work out successful strategies for access to services. The difference between the data of Dr. Valdez of an apparently non-organized community and the organized women-headed public people's organization communities is organization. Here, NGOs and left groups partnering as community organizers to develop empowered people's organizations, usually headed by women, make a difference. And to which Dr. Valdez responded, yes, the women at Rona's Garden are not organized, okay? There are initiatives to organize them, though, in particular, those women vendors at Santa Clara Church, okay, which is a kilometer away from Rona's Garden, a place where women in Rona's Garden actually, have some informal, okay, livelihood, okay, like selling flowers, okay. So a social work faculty from UP is part of the initiative, okay. However, the pandemic has interrupted this project, okay. So again, I guess one of the themes in all four papers is the impact of external forces such as the pandemic, and I think more generally climate change, okay. The Manila and Bicol case studies actually make these factors evident, okay. Yeah, so perhaps this can be a point that can be taken up during the discussion, okay. Now, if I scroll down further, here's a comment from, again, Ms. Ibita, okay, in response to the paper of Cherilyn, okay. Right, so maybe you can also see the differences with the male counterparts, both cooperative members and those that are not, especially in terms of empowerment. So I guess Ms. Ibita is trying to emphasize here a gendered lens in terms of analysis, okay, to enhance the findings of Ms. Labayo, okay. And we have another question here. I think this time Professor Rosales has a comment for the paper of Mr. Prenya on the grouper paper. Okay. Were the fishers offered in advance any guarantee of compensation in case the project results failed? If not, this may be a factor in reluctance of project people to take on innovative projects. So perhaps Mr. Prenya can respond to this comment from Professor Rosales.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Ma'am Juson, for facilitating the question. And thank you for the question, Ma'am Mary. It is unfortunate that the fishers were not offered any guarantee of compensation because they were provided because the implementers of the project were given them the materials, the inputs for free. So in case of interruption, so after the project implementation, so they are now on their own. Ano po. So it may be a factor in reluctance nga po sa pag-accept ng mga future-related projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Prenya. Now we have another comment from Ms. Ibita, and this is addressed to Dr. Valdez. Okay. Would you be able to share what online health resources did the women use given their limited access to ICTs? Okay. And how effective were they in terms of the pandemic? Okay, Dr. Valdez.
Hi. Thank you for the question. Actually, they hardly use online health resources. There was only one who did that. And what she did was log on to the online health portal of one of the public hospitals here. All the others did not, were actually not familiar or did not want to explore online health resources. So they said there was no need, actually. Even if they had complaints, health complaints, they just shrugged them off. They did not find, in general, they did not find any necessity to go to consult of doctors online for simple problems. So unless the one who consulted was only the person who was a woman who was pregnant, was about to give birth. And otherwise, all the others did not see any need actually to use online health resources, and for that, did not see any need to learn how to access on telehealth and so on.
Okay, right. So thank you so much, Dr. Valdez. Okay. Do you have any more questions from the audience? Okay. Right. So, okay, here. We have a question from Ms. Ibita addressed to Mr. Prenya. Okay. Would you say that the free materials also contributed to the end result of the project?
Thank you for that follow-up question. in terms of the free materials, I think the before suggested that they would continue the assistance, although actually out of the five fisher park associations that were provided, the ownership of the project. Three, I mean two FOs alter the operation. So maybe when we discuss it with field personnel of the APR, so they actually looking for the solutions to continue for those FOs that halter the operation. So maybe it could be the implementers can provide a strategic solution in considering the other factors of providing specific livelihood intervention for them. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Prenya. Okay. Right. So actually, I have a message here from Professor Rosales, and right. Okay. Right. And this is, I think, a very good comment. And let me just read it out loud. Okay. So, and I'll just paraphrase the comment. Okay. Can institutions like Ateneo with its superior ICT resources really move on systematically offering digital technology assistance to neighboring poor communities like Rona's Garden and others? This is the newest area of community empowerment. Right. So yes, Professor Rosales, I think this is I think a point that can be pursued concretely, because as we have seen from, let's say, the paper of Dr. Valdez, that especially in the context of the pandemic, a prerequisite to be able to economically and socially and of course, educationally participate is of course access to digital media infrastructure. I think Ateneo with its connections with telecommunication companies can actually have a kind of project, okay, to develop access in these communities that are actually nearby. Okay, right. So yes, this is definitely some project that can be pursued. Okay. And I think to which right, Marilu, Miss Marilu Ibita responded. Okay, so there's a project with Ateneo and KU Louvain from Belgium. It's a university in Belgium. So both institutions have a project. Okay. Right. So okay. So in this sense, we really see how access to digital infrastructure can be empowering in a sense that institutions or people's organizations and their partners actually depend on such infrastructure for mobilization, both material, economic, and political to continue the work with the communities. Okay, and I guess this is also evident, in rural and coastal settings. Okay. Right. Yeah. So some concrete project to think about, especially because the university plans to address what we call a cultural divide. Okay, which is actually dependent on material and social arrangements. Okay. So any more questions, comments? Okay. Right. Okay. So thank you all for your active participation in our session. Okay. So at this point, we would like to present the certificates of presentation to our presenters, and allow me to read the contents. Okay. The School of Social Sciences of the Ateneo de Manila University awards this certificate of participation to our paper presenters for their invaluable contribution during the 4th School of Social Sciences Research Conference with the theme Transitions, Transformations, and Transdisciplinarity. Doing social sciences in the time of disruptions and accelerating planetary changes, held on the 18th to the 20th of April 2022 via Zoom. This certificate is given on the 20th of April 2022 in Quezon City, Philippines. Okay. The certificate will be signed by Dr. Alfred Public and Dean Saloma Akpedenu, and will be sent to our paper presenters via email after the conference proper. Again, thank you very much and congratulations to all our presenters. To our participants, please answer our short evaluation form for the session. The link and the QR code are flashed on your screens right now. This will be our basis for tracking your participation in the conference. Only participants who were able to attend at least 3 sessions will be entitled to a certificate of attendance. Okay. So, time check. It's already 12:21. So let us all have a hearty lunch as we prepare ourselves for the rest of the conference. So we will keep this Zoom room open so you can stay connected, or you may also exit the session as you take your lunch and just click the unique link that you received on your email when you registered for the conference. We'll be back at 1:50 p.m. And thank you very much, and we hope to see everyone this afternoon. Have a good day.